Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And in this episode, we're going to answer listener questions for the month of June of 2024 is when we're releasing these. The questions, though, have been accumulating, and we're just trying to work our way through it. So most of these are questions that were submitted in January, so thank you for your patience in us getting answers to you. And because of the backlog and wanting to make sure we do a better job of getting timely answers to your questions, we're going to feature this type of episode at least on a monthly basis. So we'll have a monthly Q&A episode to go through some of the hot topics that are on your minds. And speaking of that, if you have a question you would like us to answer, send it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Or if you're already on the email newsletter, just reply to any of my emails. So yeah, if you aren't on the email newsletter, be sure to sign up. I send an email once a week with more in-depth information about that week's episode. So if you want to go a little bit deeper in some of the topics, definitely check that out because I usually provide some additional information for my email subscribers that is not available on the website and not available in our audio or video episodes. So with that, Justin, we had a really interesting set of questions that were answering today, but this time it's some very tactical, very practical, how do I do these types of questions, as well as some more philosophical questions, I'll call it, and different ways that the industry is moving and things that are happening.
You said it, Matt, and let's just dive right in here. Our first question here is from Heidi. Heidi says, we appreciate your podcast. They've been beneficial and educational. Her family owns service and mineral rights, but we lease to a gas company for operations. So her royalty terms are 12.5% of gross proceeds at the mouth of the well. And her question is, why does the gas company report to the state in MCF and then report on her check stub in MMBtu? She goes on to say that she thinks she might not be being paid correctly and looking to figure out how to walk through doing a royalty audit to see if she is being paid correctly. And Matt, this is, I'm sure, a question that many mineral owners have come up against. Some do report MCF, some report MMBtu. And typically, if you see that MCF, they also have the BTU factor there so that you can make that conversion. Do you want to talk a little bit about why they're doing that?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Heidi. It's a great question. And in terms of why some operators report to the state in MCF and MMBtu, it depends on their accounting system. If their check statement says MMBtu, that's just the way that their accounting system is reporting it. Part of the reason that they may be showing it in those units is because the prices that are paid, if you look at the NYMEX strip prices for Henry Hub natural gas, it's reported in dollars per MMBtu. So from that standpoint, it's sort of just a units thing where they're getting paid in that rather than having to do the conversion from MCF times the BTU factor, then times that dollars per MMBtu to come up with the proceeds from the sale. So there's no right or wrong answer. And then in some states, I think most states report in MCF, they report in the volumes itself rather than the energy content. So that's the difference between those two units. MCF is 1,000 cubic feet. MMBtu is in million British thermal units, which is energy content of that gas. So it's a little bit apples to oranges, and you need to convert one to the other in order to figure out if you're using dollars per MMBtu or if you're converting dollars per MMBtu to dollars per MCF. There's a conversion there. So it really just depends on which end you're doing that conversion. But either way, there are some things you can do. Like Justin mentioned, if you're getting the MCF, in other words, 1,000 cubic feet of gas, how many MCF did the well produce in a month? You can convert that to MMBtu by multiplying that number times the BTU factor. And what you would do, it's usually in terms of cubic feet per BTU. So you would convert it to MCF per MMBtu. And it's usually like a 1.3 on like the high end if it's a wet gas. In other words, it has lots of natural gas liquids. So you might see on your Oil and Gas Commission website, they report a BTU factor of 1,300. Well, you would take that divide it by 1,000 to get it into MCF, into 1,000 cubic feet, and then multiply that by the volume of gas that was produced to come up with the number of BTUs that gas contains. And the reason for that is because what's reported to the state is the wet gas volume. In other words, it's like the raw gas coming out of the well, and before they've stripped out those natural gas liquids. So that gas coming out of the well has a higher energy content than the natural gas that you use in your house for your hot water heater or for your furnace or whatever appliance you have. That's usually around a 1.03 or 1.04 BTU factor. So when they knock out that natural gas liquids, it brings the BTU factor down to get it to where it can be used as natural gas. So what you have in that raw gas, you have things like propane, butane, some of those heavier hydrocarbons that they need to strip out that are valuable. And that's why they take them out at the gas plant. And you'll get, usually if you have a wet gas that is produced by your wells, you'll see on your royalty statement volumes of natural gas and volumes of natural gas liquids or plant products. And those two combined, if you were to add the natural gas liquids back into the gas, would get you the volume that's reported to the state. So what you end up seeing is a difference in the volume that's on your check stub for the residual, or in other words, the dry natural gas after they've taken out those plant products. And that's okay. And so that's just because they have to take those natural gas liquids out. And as a result, that volume of gas will shrink. And so that is something that's very common. It's not a problem, but all that means is when you go to audit your royalty statement is it's harder to figure out what you should have gotten paid when looking at the volumes reported to the state and the volumes on your check stub. And so without having access to those gas plant statements, which, kind of a way that I look at it is whatever that raw gas or that wet gas volume is multiplied by the BTU factor and then multiplied by the natural gas price for that month, that value, then multiplied by your decimal in that well, of course, that value should at least equal or be hopefully less than what you actually got paid when you add it together, the natural gas royalty and the plant product royalty. And the reason for that is because those plant products are more valuable than natural gas. They have more energy content. And as a result, they're worth more. So that's the kind of rule of thumb that I look at is if you take, again, the raw or gas volume reported to the state multiplied by that BTU factor. Again, for example, if it's 1,000 MCF, the BTU factor is 1.3 and the gas price was $3, you would multiply 1,000 by 1.3 by 3. And that value would be what you should at least have gotten paid if you added the dry gas volume plus the plant product volume. And again, you'd have to take your decimal interest in that well and figure out what your share should have been. But that's a way to look at it from that standpoint. We have 2 episodes where we talk about how to audit royalty statements. We'll link to those in the show notes. It was episode 97 and then also episode 166. So be sure to check those out as well.
Absolutely, Matt. And just to add to that for Heidi, I find natural gas to be one of the hardest parts of keeping up with the royalties. Oil is much easier. And once you get your spreadsheet down and you have it figured out, it gets easier. But Heidi, you're not alone that this is kind of a tricky side of keeping up with your royalties. All right, Matt, on to our next one here from Greg. So Greg asked, have you done a podcast on any lithium in the Texas area, or if Elon Musk in his battery projects has any interest in it? And Matt, we did talk about this. We did an episode 208, the rise of lithium and implications for mineral right owners. We talked a little bit about lithium in East Texas and what ExxonMobil is doing as far as drilling for lithium in Arkansas currently. It's kind of an interesting thing going on, Matt, and we're not hearing a lot of news about it currently, but that's by design because some of the companies are really trying to keep it close to the chest as they learn about how to do this and what the potential is for doing this.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like Justin mentioned, it's really focused on the Smackover Formation in East Texas and then Arkansas. That's an area where they're really focusing on it right now. We had an article that we covered in the news episode for January of this year, which was episode 229. So be sure to check that one out. And we talk more about Exxon's drilling of the test wells in Arkansas in particular. But one thing I want to mention, this is an important topic that I'm sure will come up again and again. And just to stay on top of all the times that we talk about a different topic, if you're dealing with an issue or wanting to search about a particular topic, you can use the search feature on my website. When you go to mineralrightspodcast.com, you can search for any topic at the bottom of the screen from that homepage where it says, what do you want to learn today? Just type in the keywords you want to search for, and it'll list out all of the episodes kind of ranked by the most relevant. And so, for example, if you were searching for lithium, you would see things like, episode 208 show up, episode 229, and then a few others where we talk about the topic. So yeah, definitely is something where you can search for whatever topic or problem you're dealing with. And we've probably already covered it in some form or fashion. If we haven't, and you would like us to do an episode on a topic, send us an email. We'll definitely add it to the list. So hopefully that helps, Greg. But yeah, we've done some podcasts on lithium in East Texas, which brings us to the next question, actually, Justin.
Absolutely, man. And we've talked about in some of those previous episodes that the question really becomes, when are we going to start seeing boots on the ground trying to secure more leases for lithium? And our listener, Sarah, here is kind of in that situation, or at least is considering it. So Sarah goes on to say that her and her husband own about 1,000 acres in Cass County, Texas. Most of the land was inherited by her husband. And it goes on to say that they've been being approached by a landman interested in oil and gas leasing, and that they're aware of the potential of extracting lithium from the brine. It's exciting and equally scary for them. And they've got some concerns. And they're concerns of the ownership and rights of the surface and groundwater, protection for their heirs, as well as protecting the surface for the beauty of the area. And Matt, these are all really great things to be considering when you're approached for an oil and gas lease, and lots to consider. Sarah goes on to say that they really need some help in finding direction and somebody who is really knowledgeable to help them negotiate a lease. And Sarah, it sounds like you've done a lot of research on your own, and you know quite a bit going into this. So kudos on that.
Yeah, great job, Sarah. It sounds like you're very much on top of it. And I think it's definitely the right direction to get help from an attorney to make sure that any leases that you sign have favorable terms to you in terms of protecting your rights with respect to the lithium, in addition to the normal things that we negotiate for, like the royalty rate, minimizing the post-production deductions that operators can subtract from the royalties and things like that. I'll send you a couple of referrals offline of potential attorneys you could contact to help you with that. And I will say you are in a somewhat unique situation because you own both the surface and then a portion of the minerals. And so for the surface use and wanting to protect that, there's a separate agreement called a surface use agreement, which we talk about a lot more in episode 23. And so we'll link to that in the show notes as well. But it is something where you need to be mindful, like you suggested, in terms of what the operator's rights are, what your rights are, as it relates to the use of the surface for building a well pad, for using groundwater and things like that. And I do think it's an important thing that you're thinking about the next generation and making sure you protect your rights as it goes to the minerals. So I'll send you a couple of resources offline, Sarah, so that you can contact an attorney to help you with that. And good luck in negotiating a lease. I think you're in a great bargaining position. And one thing I will also add is because of the amount of minerals that you own, you're going to have a lot of bargaining power with any operator that approaches you to lease because you have a significant percentage of the minerals in a given unit that they would go and build potentially. So that means that they're going to be hopefully more willing to negotiate with you and hopefully give you some concessions in terms of some terms that will be favorable to you to help protect the land and your interests for future generations. So good luck.
And Matt, our next question here is kind of in the same tone, but this is a situation here where our listener, Nikki, inherited some minerals. And Nikki goes on to say that her father-in-law has oil and gas interests in New Mexico and Colorado through 15 different operating companies. He was a resident of California, unmarried when he passed away, and unfortunately did not have a will. She goes on to say that she's been successful in the majority of situations with getting his interest transferred to them. And there's one company, however, that is refusing to transfer the interest, saying that she needs to open probate in New Mexico. And she asked some questions related to that as far as if he wasn't a resident, does she need to probate to state that he wasn't a resident? And is it right of them to demand that the estate be probated? And Matt, this was a situation that I actually faced as well. And it is very confusing, when you have a situation where they lived in a certain state and their estate was handled properly in that state. And then you're looking at interest in another state and they say, oh, no, you've got to look into probating in New Mexico was my case as well. And this is something that comes up, Matt. And Nikki goes on to say that the amount of money involved is not huge. And so probate can often be very expensive. And it may or may not make sense depending on your situation. But it's not a good feeling to know that there's interest out there you can't get transferred to you for whatever reason it is.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it really highlights to me the issue with the continued fractionalization or splitting up of these interests over time as they're handed down from generation to generation. So maybe your great-great-grandfather owned 100% of the minerals, but then they had a bunch of kids and grandkids. And so now you have like 1/12 of the interest. And if it was not a really large mineral tract, you maybe are only dealing with a couple of net acres and the value of that might only be worth a couple of $1,000s. And so you're going to end up spending as much, or if not more than what those minerals are worth to go through probate to get them transferred into your name. And so that's the conundrum that Nikki is faced with. And she did mention that they were able to record an affidavit of heirship in each county where the properties are located. And fortunately, 14 out of the 15 operating companies accepted that. And it probably is because her husband had a very small interest, that it's likely that it's a low risk proposition for the operator to just accept that affidavit of heirship. Even if it was wrong, if they're only paying the person, $25 or $100 a year, then it's not like it's going to be a significant impact. And so it's sometimes a risk-based decision for those operators saying, yeah, it's very clear that those people are the rightful owners. The affidavit of heirship, there's probably not going to be anybody else that's going to step out of the woodwork and come and claim those interests, to where if we pay those people that claim that they're the heirs, that we would end up on the hook to pay the rightful owner. And so in this case, though, they are requiring that they open probate in New Mexico. So foreign probate or ancillary probate is what that is called. And it is very common for operators to require that, even if the person lived out of state. So they may have gone through probate. So I have a client that lives in New York, and her husband passed away, and she's in the process of selling the interest that he had owned. And because they're in New Mexico, similar situation, they had to go through that process in New Mexico to get the interest transferred over legally. And so that is a lot of times what most operators will require, is you open probate in the state where the minerals are located. In addition to, potentially you need to do it in the state where the person lived, depending on the size of the estate. So it gets to be very expensive because you're having to pay multiple attorneys to do multiple filings and things like that. Now, sometimes, again, there's some ways to streamline that, and really just getting with an attorney who's familiar with estate planning and with oil and gas can help you navigate those issues and figure out what the most cost-effective way to do it is. And unfortunately, Nikki, because she asked, is it legal for them to refuse to transfer the interest and demand that probate be opened? And, they have, technically they are correct that you don't have marketable title unless you go through probate. If an affidavit of heirship is something that can be contested, and so it does not perfect title to mineral and royalty interest. So it can be, because of that fact, some operators, especially if it's a larger interest, won't accept it because they are not comfortable with the level of risk of paying the wrong heirs. And so it's just something you have to navigate through and decide, do you want to just let that lapse and sit out there? Or maybe if there are multiple relatives that have inherited the properties over time, that maybe you guys can recombine those into a family LLC or a trust or something like that. So that is something to think about as you're doing estate planning. And if you have multiple children, multiple grandkids that they're going to eventually inherit these interests, it might be a great idea to talk with an attorney licensed in that state to figure out what the options are to keep those interests together, to maintain the bargaining power that you have when negotiating a lease, and then also just to make it worthwhile to even manage those. At some point, if they become too small, then it becomes more of a burden to even manage it or to transfer the interest, it'll be more expensive than the total amount of royalties you would ever receive from that. And so then it doesn't really make sense unless you have sentimental value associated with that property. You might as well just leave it out there because you're not going to get any financial benefit from it. So yeah, that's something that I would think about in your estate planning and your husband's estate planning and passing these down to your kids. How do you keep it together to make sure that they're not faced with that same issue that you're dealing with today? So
you said it, man. And estate planning has evolved a lot over the years. And so it's one of those things that there are options to make that transfer easier for your heirs where they're not having to go through that situation. All right, Matt, our next one here is from Eric. And this is a question that surprisingly, we don't get asked all that much. Eric goes on to say that, I enjoy your podcast, but would like to hear your take on issues with injected wastewater and issues with earthquakes and below ground blowouts. He dropped a couple links here to the issues and what they can cause. And Matt, we kind of cover this sometimes in news stories about the actual blowouts, or there was one in Texas not too long ago with an orphaned well. But this is a very complicated area and something that makes a lot of people nervous. One of the things I always get tickled at is I grew up in Odessa, West Texas. Everyone used to say, oh, it's okay if there's a pump jack out in the backyard as long as it's been there a little while. And so it brings up some questions. And now we're starting to see a lot of disposal wells out there. And people are highly concerned with what may happen someday, even if it's not today.
Yeah, that's a great point. And those two articles that Eric sent over, like Justin mentioned, there was one about a uncontrolled wastewater leak, or basically salt water coming up. But actually, they didn't have a wellbore there. It was just came up from, and kind of like whack-a-mole, popped up in the ground. It was a geyser of water pumping up. And the concern is the amount of water that they're pumping into these saline aquifers that you can't use it for drinking water. It's very deep, and they use it for wastewater disposal. So basically, they take produced water from oil and gas production, inject it down hole. And because of the amount of oil and gas that's being produced and then the amount of associated produced water, they have to deal with that water. And there's increasing amount of water that they're injecting underground. And that's causing these geysers to pop up, which is not a good situation. And then also causing earthquakes and increased seismicity. And so that is something that you would see as an indicator that maybe too much water is getting injected into a particular formation in a particular area, is when you start to feel earthquakes in that area. So decreasing the pressures, decreasing the injection rates can solve that. But it is something that the state regulator, in this case, the Railroad Commission, has to get in front of and figure out what the best solution is so that this doesn't continue to be a problem. Now, the one thing I will say is one potential solution to this is if you're able to reuse more of that produced water, then that means you're injecting less of it underground. That would help reduce that part of the issue. And that's something that we've talked about in a couple of episodes from our interview that we did with Jared Bays about produced water opportunities, which was episode 187, where he talked about beneficial use of produced water for things like agriculture, or we talked about in a couple of episodes back, and we'll try to link to that in the show notes as well, about the use of water for hydraulic fracturing and how much water it takes, and comparing that to the use of a golf course. And those are two very large users of water. Golf courses actually use more water, but one thing you could think about is, well, if you could use some of that produced water to irrigate and to water the grass on the golf course, that could be a win-win type situation. So we talk about some of those types of scenarios where maybe you could reuse some of the produced water to meet some of those irrigation needs or some of those other alternate needs, and especially in these arid areas like New Mexico. I know, for example, they're in the process of drafting updated rules for the reuse of produced water to help prolong those freshwater supplies, to protect rivers and aquifers from being overdrawn. And so if you have minerals in New Mexico, if you have surface rights in New Mexico, to check that out and see what's going on there. But I think they're trying to balance the amount of produced water. What are the requirements? How do we reuse more of that for fracking new wells, which is a great use for that, because you're just re-injecting it down hole and to a formation where you're going to get additional production, and then you're going to get some of that water back again that you can then retreat and then reuse and fracking the next well. So there's lots of advancements in water treatment that are happening to help address this issue. But yeah, it's certainly something that needs to be figured out going forward because we're continuing to use more and more water as population grows, as people, move to the Southwest and things like that. So it's an important topic for sure.
You said it, Matt. And, I think this is one of those areas that it's really a win-win on both sides. The operators want to reuse that water because it lowers the cost of bringing that water in, get more life out of it. But like you said, Matt, this is something that we really need to get figured out. And good operators are constantly evolving on this and trying to do better. But what we didn't know in the past, we didn't know. And I think that there's been some major changes in the way that we're handling that. And we hope that it helps to mitigate any future problems. But operators have seemed to be pretty committed to taking care of the issues when they do pop up, like that orphan well we talked about. Though it was not really assigned to anybody, one of the operators stepped in and said, we'll handle this and we'll pay for it. And that is what should happen. So hopefully we'll continue to see the operators take responsibility. All right, our next one here says, love the Mineral Rights Podcast. Thanks for keeping me informed. He's run into a situation in North Dakota where they're non-consenting mineral right owners on a section in McKenzie County. Their family didn't know about the drilling until about a decade after production started due to complex inheritance issues. Basically, he's in a situation to where the money was escheated to the state, and the current operator brought the wells about 3 years ago and are now paying the correct royalty going forward. When he asked about the past royalties, the current operator claims that responsibility falls to the previous operator and that they wouldn't cover them. And Matt, this is an issue I have faced as well, and can get really tricky really fast. Most states have a statute of limitations on when they do have to pay back royalties. However, I've fallen into that situation to where the current operator was not the person producing it, and they referred me to the previous operator to try to chase down the money, which is, in my experience, a very difficult thing to go through.
Yeah, that's a good point. The statute of limitations is something to be aware of. I'm not sure what that is in North Dakota, so that's something I would look into. It would be important to get an attorney to help you to make sure that you are understanding your rights as it relates to those claims on past royalties. A couple of different things as it comes to forced pooling. So you mentioned in your email that you were forced pooled because they were unable to contact you to lease when they went to go drill. And so what happens when they're forced pooled, like mentioned in his email here, is that you receive the statutory minimum royalty rate, because you're forced pooled. And then once the initial cost of drilling and completing that well plus a risk penalty is paid back, you back into your full proportional share of the proceeds from the sale as well as the expenses associated with that well. And that basically become a non-operated working interest owner at that point. In general, depending on the state, obviously each state is a little bit different, but the thing that he's talking about is that the current well has paid back that original cost of drilling multiple times over at this point. And so since they were only getting the statutory minimum, which they've corrected that now and they're getting the full amount with his current operator. But what he's referring to is, when did that payback occur with that original operator? And the amount that was escheated to the state, is it correct? And so that's a difficult proposition because you just get a check, when you go and claim that from the state. You don't know the details. You don't have the royalty statements associated with it. You don't have all the details to where you could audit that payment to see if it's correct. And so that is something where I would definitely go back to that original operator and see if they can provide that accounting. They should have that. It's something before they sold that interest, it was part of their records. And so it's something where you could see if you could get a copy of it. It may be difficult, like Justin said, depending on the statute of limitation, they may not have to give it to you. It just depends on how far back it occurred and what the statute of limitations is in North Dakota. But yeah, that 50% risk penalty, I would have assumed that the previous operator had accounted for that and backed you into your proportional share of that non-operated working interest for the remaining percentage. And then those net proceeds should be escheated to the state in addition to those initial statutory minimum royalties. And so whatever is sitting in the state coffers should be basically your money to claim. And they said, I would have thought this money would be set aside in an escrow account that would have been transferred with the sale of operation. And unfortunately, that is not typically the case. If they have, unlocatable royalty owners, they hand that over to the state to get that off their books. And so there's, each state has requirements for when that is to occur, and then the state will administer it going forward, and it's sitting out there in perpetuity. So people come along later and those companies are long gone, that you still can claim that money. So it's a benefit, I think, to the royalty owners from that standpoint, especially if you're looking at a situation like yours where you've inherited it decades after they initially drilled the well. The original operator may have gone bankrupt, and if you were in the situation where they were trying to hold it on their books and hoping that you would come and claim it, then depending on the way that they look at, should it have been your property and it wouldn't have been something that had been part of the bankruptcy proceedings, then maybe it wouldn't have been an issue, but there's a chance that you would be out of luck. And so, yeah, I would just say, again, going to ask for revenue statements for the escheated funds so you compare the minimum royalty payments and see when they switched over to the minimum royalty plus the non-operated working interest. And so you would have seen probably a bump in that payment, whenever that occurred. But yeah, without looking at the revenue statements, I don't think there's any way to figure out whether or not they paid you correctly. So good luck. Again, hopefully you're able to get some traction and be able to contact that original operator and get some of that information.
Absolutely, Matt. And to add to that, depending on what the amount potentially could be, this is an area where you could certainly get with an attorney, but that would be a situation to where the amount is pretty high and would be worth it to go through some kind of litigation for previous companies if they exist. The attorneys in this area, it's something that they know how to do and might be able to make a little bit more traction. And also be aware that the way that each operator handles this can be different. In my situation, I had one operator that was really giving me the runaround about letting me see payout statements and that kind of thing. And then when it was sold to another operator, they were much easier to work with, though they did not have that previous information still.
Yeah. So good luck. And again, definitely sounds like a situation to consult with an attorney to get some advice, understand your options. Like Justin mentioned, if you're not getting traction and getting access to that information, at least within the statute of limitations, maybe there's some money out there that you could go after through litigation. So good luck with that. So that wraps up this month's listener questions episode. Again, if you have a question you would like us to answer, send it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks for listening. And also be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening to this. It really helps us get the word out and get this information to the people that need it. So thanks again. And thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.